My baby dolls, we are back again. Another episode of Genesis. As always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz, and today we got another great episode coming up for you. We're talking more baseball, but we're talking time machine baseball, where we take the time machine back to the 1870s and 1880s, and we're talking about the summer of beer and whiskey. How Brewers, Barkeeps, Rowdies, Immigrants, and a wild pennant fight made baseball America's game. And we're talking about the season of 1883. We're talking pre-Ty Cobb in the dead ball era, which, of course, is my site on Facebook. And, of course, I give a lot of information about the years of 1900 till 1919, 1920. But this supersedes it. There might never have been a dead ball era if not for this era. And, of course, we're going to have Ed Achorn on, and we're going to talk to him. And Ed's wonderful. He's up here with me in New England and writes for the Providence News-Journal. But before we even get to Ed or the book, The Summer of Beer and Whiskey, you are listening to the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. And, of course, we have a lot of programming on. We got the new show with Mark Littell, who was that famous pitcher who up the home run, to Chris Chambliss in the 1976 American League Championship Series, and they'll always joke about it. It's funny now, 40-something years later. It wasn't funny then. We got Peter Golenbach in Golenbach's University. I, of course, am honored to be on the show with David Nemec and Sabre maven Alan Blumkin, and we do their show, David Nemec's Old Time Baseball and Trivia. Not to mention, I do Giants Baseball. That's Z for the Zigzag Man, Ralph Tycho himself, our producer. And we talk about the New York Giants and the San Francisco Giants and any learning that can come out of there, as well as Oakland A's. And it's just really a treat and an honor to be with these guys, because these guys I read when I was a little kid. And, speaking to people like, Ed Achorn, who writes for the Providence News-Journal, Hal Bach. I mean, these guys were the ones that I read, and Peter Golenbach, and to be on with them, it's just an amazing thing to me. I am very honored that these people come to my show, and we're able to teach you folks about baseball and stuff you might not know, and what this book does. It lets us know what we don't know, and we go back to the 70s and 1880s. And in the book, Ed focuses on St. Louis, but of course we branch out into Yale, and we branch out into Cincinnati, and we branch out into others. We see about the differences between the National League of Baseball and other areas, to why the American Association was created. It's stories that many of us don't know as baseball fans, but it is a very interesting look, and I highly recommend, even before I have Ed on the show, I highly recommend getting this book, just so you can learn about things like the reserve clause, which we'll talk about, the differences between the National League. We'll talk about why it was called the League of Beer and Whiskey. We'll talk about barehanded baseball, injuries. It's all coming up on this show. And as for Edward Achorn, he has been a Pulitzer Prize finalist for distinguished commentary. Is the deputy.
No, I'm the editorial page editor. That's outdated.
Oh, jeez. There you go. Hey, see all the big shots. They come on my show, right? They come on. When are you going to give me a job, will you? He has won numerous writing awards, and his work appears in Best Newspaper Writing back in 2007 to 2008. And it's just an amazing thing to have him. Welcome to the show, Ed. I hope I didn't butcher you too much. Is there anything else I missed about you?
No, Ian, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, it's the Providence Journal, and I'm the vice president and editorial page editor. But obviously I love baseball, and I've written 2 books about it. One, The Summer of Beer and Whiskey, and one about Old Hoss Radbourne, called 59 and 84.
Yeah, we have to. You You got to send me that book because that's another book, and we'll get you on the show. Because I kid you not, this is a stellar book. I know when I instant messaged you the other day, I didn't spell check it correctly. I said the season, and I guess I must have jumbled my words at the just put that. It is the summer of beer and whiskey. Why are you so interested in this time period?
I just think it's a great period of colorful baseball history, and it's very difficult to get at because it's just so long ago, and you got to go back to the original sources to sort of tease out all the fun stuff that was happening at that time. And so it's just great. It's like going into a time machine and seeing things you've never heard about before, and seeing baseball stars you didn't know about, and how they actually perform day to day, and how America loved baseball in the 1880s. So to me, it's just a blast to see this unknown world.
And let me ask you this, because no one is alive to interview. You might have family members and stuff like that, but of course, I mean, we're talking about 130 years ago. When you go to your sources, newspaper clippings and everything else, how do you decipher what's true or not?
Well, it's like any kind of history. It's known as the lies everybody agrees to. But you just have to sort of piece together your best sense of what stories make sense, what stories go along with other evidence that you've come across. And going into baseball in the 1880s in the newspapers, you got to learn a whole different language because there's all sorts of little slang terms, and so you really have to get into this whole different culture to sort of understand what's going on.
Let's talk about the National League first, because I want to give a setup before we even talk about 1883 and Chris Ahi and all that. Tell me about the National League. It originated in 1876. By the early 1880s, what was baseball like?
Well, yeah, the National League was created to try to give some ownership control of baseball. They felt that there was a previous league called the National Association of Professional Baseball Players, and the National League was different because it was organized around clubs. They really wanted the clubs and the owners to control the game. They were worried about the game being too ridden with corruption, too ridden with bad experiences at the ballparks, because there were gamblers there were thugs there were prostitutes. So they were trying to sort of clean up the game, and the National League was based in sort of the eastern cities of America, the ones with blue laws, no Sunday baseball, and the National League they banned beer at the ballpark, they banned gambling at the ballpark, they charged 50 cents admission, which doesn't sound like much to us, but back then was quite a lot. And so they were trying to keep the riffraff out and sort of have this upper middle class experience for fans. And so that's basically where the National League was coming from. And that sort of sets up a contrast to the American Association, which grew up in the wake of the National League.
Now let me ask you this, before I even get to the American Association. If 20 years later, the American League is formed by Kaminsky, who is in the book, by the way, which
yes,
very, very, who's in the book, and Ban Johnson, and they create the American Leagues to get the impurities out of the National League and to start a competing league. How was before you even get to the association, if the National League was based upon what you just told me, how did it get as corrupt as it did after the 1880s?
Yeah, it just developed into this sort of, it didn't stick to those principles. And the thing is, it became kind of corrupt because that was what America was like. And this is sort of the recurring themes the books I'm writing, I just discover any area you look at baseball, it says an immense amount about the culture. So this game in the 19th century was a very brutal, tough game. And people had to really work hard and struggle hard to survive in that period. So they were, in the National League, these players became very sort of, not corrupt, but they were cheating. They were using every advantage they could get. They were tripping runners. They were grabbing their belts as they ran by. They were doing all sorts of stuff. And also the owners of the National League weren't particularly careful about serving the fans the best way they could. And they created these issues with sort of cross-ownership of teams. So you had cases where they were moving all the good players from one team to another, and you lost the competitive balance. So that was some of the problems afflicting the National League.
And let me ask you this. So now, this is a renegade league, the American Association, right? Why was
That's
it
right.
created, and why was it created, and what did they intend to do with it?
It was created because the National League had shed some of these really good baseball markets, Cincinnati and St. Louis, and also they were not allowing beer at games, and they weren't playing Sunday ball. And in these other cities, they had large immigrant populations from Germany, especially, and they liked Sunday events. They liked getting out with the family on Sundays. They didn't just shut down and keep everything quiet as on the East Coast. So the American Association was founded by guys who thought they could make some money with these local teams that played ball on Sunday, and they sold beer at the ballpark as a way to bring more of these people in. And they charged half as much as the National League. They charged 25 cents basic admission to get inside the ballpark. And so all of a sudden, people in those days, they worked really Monday through Saturday. Sunday was their only day off. So immigrants could have a chance to go to the ballpark, to go with their family, to pay a reasonable admission price, to have a nice beer, and it just took off. Baseball suddenly became vastly more popular in this American Association. They got way more than twice the attendance of the National League, and it really rejuvenated baseball after it was going downhill under the National League's leadership.
And let me ask you this: with baseball is already ingrained. I know you wrote in the book that when these teams in the American Association were doing well, attendances really flourished. How did it do? If you found any research when you were doing your research, how did it fare against the National League?
Yeah, it was more than twice the attendance of the National League, quite dramatically more. And this started to terrify the National League. Now, they dismissed the American Association as the Beer and Whiskey League, which is sort of how I got the title of the book. They viewed it as a bunch of really scummy customers who were the fans were more rowdy at their games, and they thought they were ruining the reputation of baseball by having this sort of wild and crazy league. But what they ended up doing was bringing in these colorful new players and really making baseball a lot of fun.
And let me ask you this. First of all, I'll go into the name itself. 2 words, not one. When did they change it to 1 word?
Oh, baseball. That's right. It was 2 words throughout the 19th century. I think in the early 20th century it became 1 word. But it was baseball. And different rules then. The game was played barehanded, if you can imagine that, with a baseball that was pretty much as hard as the modern ball. One difference, though, was they used 1 ball per game. If it was hit into the stands, the fans were required to throw it back on the field. So, so you ended up by the end of this is just to save money. The owners didn't want to spend a lot on baseballs. So a modern game, I was talking to Ben Mondor, the late owner of the Pawtucket Red Sox about this. He said, guess how many balls we use a game now? And it turns out to be 104 per game. In the 1880s, they used one baseball per game. By the end of the game, it was all ragged and beaten up, and it was pretty hard to hit for any great distance. So it was a different kind of game then. It was more strategic. You were more punching the ball into the outfield, a lot more aggressive play. You had players like King Kelly who would run. I should mention this: there was one umpire a game, and again to save money. Now there's 4 per game. But with one umpire per game, if he's looking at a ball being hit to right field and the runner's on second base, sometimes the runner would just not even touch third and run straight home. Somebody named King Kelly was famous for doing that, and the crowd would howl and scream, but the umpire didn't always see what was going on. One time an umpire called Kelly out, even though he seemed to be safe at the plate, and Kelly was screaming, "Why'd you call me out?" And the umpire said, "You got here too fast." So that was it was a kind of a wild and crazy game, and it was very tough. As I mentioned, they would trip runners. They'd grab their belts to make it slow them down as they're running around the bases. A lot of flashing of spikes. Very, very tough game. If the pitcher worked out of a box rather than a mound, so we still hear the phrase that he was knocked out of the box, and that's from this period. It was a flat box. It was closer to home plate than the modern pitcher's mound, and at least at the start. And it was the pitcher could take sort of a running start and whip the ball in. And there was no protective equipment really. I mean, there was no batting helmet or anything of that sort, no gloves. The catcher had mitts and a mask and a chest protector, but no knee guards. So it was very, very, very dangerous for catchers in that period. So, I mean, it all contributed to make for this really tough, violent game. You had 9 players suiting up for a game, and the rest of the team didn't wear a suit because it was in those days you couldn't substitute during the game unless a player was too badly injured to go on. So the players who weren't suited up for the game were sent out front to help collect tickets to save money for the owners. So you had this kind of really tough game. You had to be strong and tough to make it. There was no player unions, so when a player was injured, he was just essentially dropped from the team, and his money stopped. So they would play injured. They would play. These guys were not, nursing themselves back to health. They were playing hard all the time. Pitchers. Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, because I want to hear more of this.
Well, the pitchers, there was 1 or 2 pitchers for a team, so they racked up these incredible numbers of innings pitched. I mean, it's almost unbelievable. In my old Haas book, I write about him. He won 59 games in 1 year. He started 78 games and completed 78 games. You can imagine this, 678 innings, just unbelievable stuff. And they would throw sometimes underhanded when the ball was dead enough from being beaten to crap by the end of the game. But they also threw overhand fastballs and curveballs and all this stuff, and they really wrecked their arms. A lot of these pitchers only lasted a few years, 1 or 2 or 3 years, and the owners would just dump them and get somebody else. So it was a tough time, tough game. America was like that then. There were labor unions weren't strong at all in America. People worked very long hours at very dangerous jobs, often injuring themselves horribly on these jobs. There was no OSHA making sure everybody was safe and all that. So this baseball grew out of that no holds barred, very competitive, very tough culture that created America.
Yeah, and I think you answered my next question. Why would even these guys, play this game? Because again, you get hit with a ball, you have no protective equipment, your arms are blown out, you're sliding, the brutal, grimy, and you got the gamblers who are fixing games too. People,
oh yes,
people don't realize. When baseball was created with, Alexander Cartwright and Doc Adams, it was done for exercise. But once the gamblers got a hold of it, it just changed the whole dynamics of baseball. Let's explain a little bit about the time here.
Yeah, well, baseball clubs were originally clubs. I mean, they were sort of health clubs. Guys got together to hang out and get some exercise and play this new game and make business contacts and that kind of thing. So they were clubs, and they had extravagant feasts and all that stuff, and gave each other awards, and they sort of just for the fun of it. But they quickly discovered it was kind of expensive to maintain these fields for baseball. So somebody hit on the idea of putting a fence around the field and charging admission, because fans would like to come watch them play. And once they did that, that changed the whole dynamics of the sport. They quickly discovered if you had sort of ringers, good players, playing for your team, that would attract more fans. So it sort of snowballed from there. It became a professional game. Even though they were theoretically amateurs at the time, they were being paid under the table and so forth. And they finally openly acknowledged professionalism in the late 1860s. In 1869, the Cincinnati Red Stockings were the first openly professional team. And they traveled the country, and I think, what did they win? 69 games with no losses. I mean, it was incredible. It just showed how professionalism just dominated the amateur game. So that's what it grew out of. And you ask, why would these players do this? Why would they subject themselves to sometimes really bad injuries that maimed them for life? Well, this was the culture at the time. You were outside, breathing fresh air, playing a game for, it'd be with practice and the game, it'd be 5 hours a day or something. This was luxury compared to what most Americans endured in those times. They worked 12-hour days in factories and worked 6 days a week and got very little money. Probably $500 a year is what a laborer might get. Baseball player would get $1,000, $2,000. So they were still middle class, but they were paid well, and they got to be outside instead of in these dangerous situations. I mean, you look at coal mines at the time, you look at farms at the time. Those were brutal. Just the work you had to put into farming in those days was terrible, and it was boring, and it was even dangerous. So baseball was, it looks very tough when you look at it compared to the modern game, but when you look at it compared to the America of the times, it was almost a wonderful way to make a living.
And there was no bars, as you mentioned, on African-American baseball. They talk about Moses Fleetwood Walker in the book. What's going on with him?
I love this because baseball there were bars. In the original National Association, black players started playing, and they wrote some language that they in their rules that they wouldn't permit black players, which is pretty shameful. But in the American Association, they permitted black players to play. So the first openly acknowledged black player. There may have been a black player for the Providence Grays in 1880s, but he didn't acknowledge that he was black, and he was sort of light-skinned and so forth. But the first openly black player was Moses Fleetwood Walker for the Toledo team in the American Association. He was a catcher. He was college educated, which was pretty rare for players in those days. Very smart guy, very strong guy, like sort of like a Jackie Robinson. He was college educated, as I said. He was able to withstand the horrible racial epithets thrown his way, and pretty good tough ball player. And it was only later that, largely through the influence of Cap Anson, very big white star of the day, that the color line was drawn, and blacks were kept out of baseball for generations.
Now, I love the story you tell about Cap Anson. He's a little kid sleeping in his bed, wakes up in the night, and what does he say?
Yes, he sees an Indian standing. He was taunting the local Indian tribes. He grew up as a pioneer kid in Iowa, and he and some friends were sort of taunting and teasing the Indians. And then he describes in his book how he woke up one night and there was an Indian standing at the end of his bed who could have very easily killed him. And he told his father this the next day, and the father dismissed it. At least this is according to his book, which was ghostwritten. But he went through life sort of taunting and teasing other races, and he did this with blacks. In 1883, he played an exhibition game in Toledo against this team that had Moses Fleetwood Walker, and the story is that he said, "Get that N-word off the field," and Toledo, to its credit, refused to do it, and he had to play the game against this guy, and that infuriated him so much that he went to work on trying to keep blacks out of baseball. He thought it brought down the dignity of the game, and he had much support in those days with his point of view. A lot of the white players didn't want the competition from the black players. There was sort of it's quite interesting to discover this when you go back and look. There was kind of a vibrant professional black baseball scene, even in the 1880s. Different cities had professional black teams, and this was before the Negro Leagues and all that. And they would go from city to city, and the black professionals and people would go out to these games, and they'd feel pride in watching these guys play. And even some of the white players would go to these games and watch the black players, and they were kind of impressed with how good they were. So, it's kind of a tragedy that the Jim Crow era really came down in concert with Cap Anson's efforts to keep out black players, and this sort of succeeded in crushing the opportunity for blacks to play until, 1949 with Jackie Robinson.
Oh, yeah, 47. Now, let me just...
47, I'm sorry.
Right. Let me just make a commentary on this. I know you mentioned it in the book, the Supreme Court hadn't ruled yet on Plessy versus Ferguson, which took place in 1896, where they came down on the Pullman car saying, separate
right,
but equal, and then the country just, segregated right after that, and it wouldn't be until the late 40s. But they did have a case at the time that publicly you could not discriminate against Negroes, but privately you can. And, of course, these were private enterprises, weren't they?
Right, that's right. So the leagues were allowed to get away with it, and the black ball players formed their own teams and created the Negro Leagues. So you had those two parallel leagues.
Yeah, and I was astonished. In one of the chapters, Walker shows up for a game. He's told he can't play. The crowd's screaming and screaming and screaming. This is unfair. He goes in, fully dressed. They put
yes.
Up. Hey, talk about that a little bit. I love that story.
Well, yes, he did. Well, you're going to have to help me because you've read it more recently.
Hey, well,
than I have.
you know what I'm doing. I'll tell you what. I'll tell you what, because you wrote this book a few years ago. But
yeah,
you know, I always do my homework, and all the authors are like, wow, I forgot about it.
No, I remember
wow.
the incident, but not all the details of it. But he did have great courage to show up.
Yeah, and you know what? They were throwing in. Everyone's yelling, so they made him go on the field. Then Anson screaming that I think it was in Toledo. Anson screaming that he shouldn't be there. And then they put him on the bench, take him back off the bench, and finally they bench him for the rest of the game. That's how crazy.
Yeah. No, in that game you described, it was in Louisville, and a guy ran on the field and grabbed Fleetwood Walker and by the collar and tried to forcibly eject him from the ballpark. And they could have had a riot right there, a race riot. But Walker kept his cool and walked back to his seat and watched the game from there. I mean, it's just amazing what happened. He was also, when he played in the American Association, he was getting death threats. And even his own he was a catcher. And the catcher and pitcher had to work together, or it was very dangerous. You had to know what kind of pitch was coming and be ready for it as a catcher with less equipment than they have now. Well, his pitcher wouldn't tell him what kind of pitch was coming because he didn't like playing with a Negro. So there you go. His own teammate was double crossing him. So he had a really hard road to hoe as a black player in America, and it's just such a tragedy that this line came down, because I think Jackie Robinson had a huge impact on desegregation of America and advancing the cause of blacks in America. It's just, when you see someone on a ball field, we're all equal, and it's all based on your talent. And that's something that's so important to see. It speaks volumes more than any sort of argument you can make. There it is on the field in front of you.
And you know, Martin Luther King Jr. always said about Jackie, he began the civil rights movement, not him. Because he was only like 17 years old when Jackie came up, and and I have plenty of pictures I post on my Negro League sites. I don't know if you're in it in Facebook, maybe you are. I don't know. I get so many people following me. It's hard to I don't know, but people tell you I'm learning a lot. But anyway, yeah, Jackie. You see, baseball was saved by Babe Ruth later on, of course, after the whole Black Sox incident. But Jackie Robinson, he saved America. He didn't save the game, and unfortunately for Cap Anson, we have to. A lot of people are like, let's get him out of the Hall of Fame. You can't. He was a great player, but he was a product. He was a product of his time, and that was the time period. And immigration, too, was frowned upon. The Chinese and the Germans and everything. And this is where we come to our most colorful character of the book, Chris van der Ahe, who... Wait a minute, this is great. Am I saying his last name right, Ahe?
I think you are, actually.
Yes. Ahe. Yeah.
I pronounce it Chris van der Ahe, but I think you're right. The Ahe is the more German, authentic pronunciation.
And he is, and he was the Bill Veeck and Charlie Finley, the master show person, and he has something in common with Steinbrenner, George Steinbrenner. He's German. Now, I love the way why he bought into the St. Louis Browns, which later on would become the Cardinals. But that's right. This is a great story. I want you to tell it. Why would this German immigrant buy a baseball team when you know nothing about it? And then, just like Charlie Finley, who ran an insurance company up in Chicago, didn't know nothing about baseball, he created that Swingin' A's team that won 3 world championships and was just embattled with his managers and players just as Ahe was.
Yeah, Chris van der Ahe is, to me, he belongs in the Hall of Fame. He's a wonderful, colorful character. He came here from Germany when he was a young man. He opened a grocery in St. Louis, which in those days had a saloon in the back of it. People would come in for drinks, and he noticed that on game days, with the strange game being played down the street called baseball, he noticed on game days he'd get a much bigger crowd, and he began to think about, using this game as a way to sell beer. It's just like the way you'd use pretzels to help people, to prompt people to buy beer in his saloon. So when a series of prominent white Native Americans had, of course, Chris was white, but Native Americans had tried to make baseball succeed in St. Louis and had repeatedly failed. In comes Chris, who knows not a lot about the game, a little, but not a lot, and he decides to risk his life savings on this, and he leases the ballpark, and he creates this professional team that's the founding of the St. Louis Cardinals, one of the most important franchises in baseball, and still a place where baseball is absolutely loved. And this is they owe it to this guy, Chris Vandre, who was a German immigrant. He was quite a character. He was constantly getting into various scrapes. He was a womanizer. One day his wife came to the ballpark and saw his girlfriend sitting there and hit her over the head with a Coke bottle. And there was just one thing after another with him. And he was, I think he was kind of like the Yogi Berra of his time, because he would say these quirky things. I killed one bird with a double stone. He would say he was angry once because he I think he sold a player who was pretty good, and he said I should have listened to mine own advice. And he was just this funny guy who I just love him. I think he's wonderful, but he somehow figured out how to surround himself with people who really knew a lot about baseball and could build these really good teams. And he knew how to do that. He knew how to attract fans. He did all sorts of innovative things, like turning his ballpark into a multi-use facility. I mean, at one point he had sort of carnival stuff in the deep in the outfield, and he had when he first created the team, he had a beer garden in right field. I mean, there were actual tables out there in right field. If you hit the ball far enough, it would roll over to the tables of people sitting there quaffing beers. So, quite character. I love him. He had fireworks at his ballpark at night. People would come in and see the fireworks, and this was, very innovative for the time.
And he tried, and what, he really did see William Hulbert, who was the president of the National League, as an adversary. And he tried to do things so different to liven up the league and stuff that, he definitely is the pioneer of bringing people into the stands, just like Bill Veeck did with, Disco Demolition Night and, and you got Charlie Finley with the orange ball and the donkey and the petting zoo in Kansas City, and you got the rabbit popping out of home plate scaring the umpires half to death. He tried, and he succeeded for the most part. Although you do mention at the end of the book, Ahi, suffered greatly, and in the end, he was near he wasn't as rich as he was previously.
Right. Well, he overextended himself, and then he kept getting divorced, which will clean out someone's income pretty fast. and he overextended himself, and then he ran into trouble when there was a national depression and all that, and he ended up back at his saloon, working behind the bar with no money. I mean, it was kind of sad. And he only survived because his former player and manager with whom he had many difficult times, Charlie Comiskey, would send him money to keep him alive. Now, Comiskey's gone down in history as this notorious skinflint, and in the movie 8 Men Out, he's portrayed as this fat, unfeeling owner who gives the guys flat champagne when they win the Pennant, and is just this nasty, greedy guy. But that's not really what he was in real life. He was very generous to this old Chris Vonderay when he was on the downslope of life. But Vonderay was, he was so flamboyant. He wore these crazy checkered suits, and he had a statue of himself made that if you go to this very beautiful cemetery in St. Louis, and you can see the giant mausoleums for the beer barons, and then you're walking along, and there's Chris Vonderay's statue on top of this giant gravestone, and he's strutting forward triumphantly, and it's just really funny to see this guy. He's a classic German-looking guy with his moon-shaped face and a big mustache and these wonderful smiling eyes, and he lived life with great zest and enjoyment. And even though he went downhill at the end after risking everything, he's just a wonderful figure in baseball, and everybody's forgotten him pretty much. The National League sort of was the establishment figures in the National League were the ones who created the Hall of Fame, and they really gave short shrift to all the American Association figures, and they would have never dreamed of letting Chris Vonderay in there because he's too wild and extravagant and tacky and all that. But I think he belongs there in the Hall of Fame.
And he really does. And you know what's surprising to me? Again, of all the places, St. Louis, but has a big German population. So, but again, we got to look at history. And at the time, when this was going on, you had Otto von Bismarck going on, and the whole German Revolution that they're finally going to, unite all the Confederates. A lot of people were dying out there. It wasn't very good in Germany. My thing is how people accepted him because he had a very thick accent, like you mentioned, and there, Did you find any sources that said that they were prejudiced against him, like any other immigrant at the time?
Well, there were some prejudices against the Germans at the time, but it really kicked in later after the 2 World Wars. That's when it became really uncool to be German in America, but for obvious reasons. But I think there was such a large German population, and they were so prominent that they sort of were able to make their way in cities like St. Louis. But there's obvious intense prejudice against him just in the way he was covered. He was kind of presented as a total buffoon in the press and that sort of stuff. He was sort of made a caricature, but I think he played on that himself just to get attention and to have some fun with the reporters and so forth. So he was always very extravagant when like press people from another city came to visit his park. He said he would greet them and say, "My box is at your exposal." So they all had fun with him.
And something, he hired Ted Sullivan that year when Sullivan was, on the St. Louis, Browns team. How was their relationship, and how did Sullivan impact the players?
Yeah, Ted Sullivan's an interesting figure from early baseball as well. He was a very good sort of, they called them, they weren't really minor leagues associated with the major leagues then. They were just lesser professional leagues, and he did quite a good job in Des Moines, and in part because he had old Hoss Radbourn as his pitcher, so that always helps. But then he knew a lot about baseball, and Vondre recognized he had to have somebody who really knew the game, so he brought this guy, Ted Sullivan, in. Ted was a great storyteller, but he had a very strong temper. And I write in the book about an incident that happens right at the peak of the Pennant race, that the two have this massive fight. So it's kind of funny, and it affects the whole Pennant race.
And you know my favorite character in the book. I mean, this just, when I read about him, I was like, this guy is my favorite character for this. And now I have to do my homework. Jumping Jack Jones. Now, if I saw someone pitch like this guy did, I would throw my bat and try to break his legs at him. Just like in the '72 American League Championship when Bert Campaneris threw his bat at the Tigers pitcher over there. This guy was crazy. Let's talk
it's
about
very
that.
funny. He was, back then, the college baseball was kind of important, and the Ivy League teams were the most talented ones. And this guy pitched for the Yale team. His mother was actually the first woman dentist, I think, in America, maybe anywhere. And she sent him to Yale, and he developed this pitching style that nobody had ever seen before, which is where he would jump up in the air and throw the ball as he was jumping. And it totally baffled the hitters because they were distracted. They didn't know what was going on. And midway into the season, the Philadelphia Athletics, who had a very good pitcher named Bobby Matthews, and some other pitchers, and they kept their arms were really dying out there. So in desperation, they brought on this Jumping Jack Jones, and he was it's so funny to read the descriptions of him pitching in these crucial pennant games. He's jumping up, throwing the ball as he jumps. He's striking out these major league hitters who are, very tough professionals and didn't like this at all. And the crowd's going crazy, and I actually have illustrations in the book of what he looked like pitching, and a cartoon drawn by one of the victims of his pitching named Charlie Riley, who was a first baseman for the Cincinnati Reds. He was a good cartoonist as well, and he drew a picture of this guy pitching, and it's just hilarious. I just love this stuff. This is why it's so fun to look at 1880s baseball, because you learn all these things you've never heard of, and there they are right in front of you.
And this ushers in. Let me ask you about Lou Simmons, because he was on the Athletics as the manager, if I'm not mistaken. The Pennant, I don't want to give away the book, so we're not going to talk about who wins or who loses. I want people to come
sure.
to this book, But Lou Simmons, he was his adversary for the most part. Let's talk about Simmons and his impact on the league at the time.
Yeah, Simmons was a very shrewd guy as well. He was a former star of the American stage. He was a minstrel singer. And that was that, it's horrible now when you think of it, these people dressing up in blackface and doing these sort of racist impersonations of blacks. But these were enormously popular shows at the time. Abraham Lincoln was a fan, and they played all these great, they sang all these great songs written by Stephen Foster and other people. Still treasured songs in the American Songbook, and he introduced the song "When Johnny Comes Marching Home," believe it or not, as a minstrel star during the Civil War. But he also played baseball on the side, and he was quite a good ball player. And then he and a couple other guys pulled all their money and did this crazy investment on baseball when nobody would touch it. He would try to sell it to the local sports editors, and they tell him to go away. Baseball's a dead crow, is what they called it. That's how bad baseball had gotten in the early 1880s. The National League had thrown out Philadelphia as one of its cities. for various offenses. And so this guy said, hey, this is a great market. We can make baseball work. So he invested in this team, the Philadelphia Athletics, which live on today as the Oakland Athletics. And he he put together a really excellent team, and he was Andre's adversary. And there's all sorts of funny stories during the season where Vandere, there's cartoons and stuff in the book about making fun of how Simmons went out and got this jumping jack, and poor Vandere was left without a comparable celebrity to bring onto his team.
And it is with the owners. They were colorful. They were, they were eccentric, but they knew they had to monopolize this, and so we have the birth of the reserve clause. Let's talk about that a little bit here.
Yeah, the reserve clause was a brilliant invention by the Boston Red Stockings owner, Arthur Soden, who the Boston Red Stockings became the Boston Braves, which are now the Atlanta Braves. But they were discovering that the baseball was essentially a free agent game at the start. Players could sign for the highest amount anyone was willing to pay them, and they would jump from team to team. And the owners concluded this was, for their own selfish reasons, that this was damaging to baseball, that the fans couldn't follow these teams because their favorite stars kept jumping to other clubs. So they created this thing called the reserve clause, where they could reserve a certain number of players. It started originally with 9, and then it crept up to virtually everybody on the team. They could reserve their contract. They could reserve them beyond the length of their contract to the following season, and that made it much harder for players to sell themselves to the highest bidders. And if they tried to jump to another team, they were banished from baseball. And so that was one of the reasons the National League was very scared when the American Association suddenly took off, because players could just jump to this other league and make a lot more money, and it was much more of a free agent type situation. But then, of course, the American Association realized, oh boy, we'd better do the same thing, so they instituted a reserve as well.
And now this brings us to my last topic here, and I was disappointed not to see John Montgomery Ward, who probably, and now we're talking local because he was part of the Providence Grays, and a lot of people from Rhode Island, a lot of people, they listen to my show all over the place, New York, California. But Providence had a team from 1878 to 1885, and Montgomery Ward over here, he was instrumental, and he had a very good demeanor about him, that he was able to organize as well, be a good player as well. Let's talk about Montgomery Ward here.
Sure, he was a very smart college-educated player, which was a great rarity at the time. And as a player, he went out and got his law degree, which was unheard of at the time as well. He was a very good pitcher, ruined his arm, pitched the Providence Grays to the 1879 Pennant. After that, he had to change and become an infielder because he had wrecked his arm. As many players did in those days, and often they weren't good enough to go to another position, but he was good enough. He also played a great role in introducing golf to America and making that popular. He worked with George Wright, who was one of his teammates with the Providence Grays, along those lines. But he's most famous for founding the first baseball players union. He realized this game was rigged against ball players, that they had few protections, that they couldn't sell their services to the highest bidder. And he, working with his fellow players, did this incredible thing in 1890 where they created a separate league run by the players called the Players League, and that really almost brought down baseball. They couldn't sustain it. It was there were 3 leagues operating, and the quality of the game was too depressed by that. I mean, it was thinned out, and the Players League, which was probably the best major league in 1890, went under. It just couldn't sustain itself. But it threw a scare into baseball, and it led to the creation of the first baseball union. And he's a very, very important figure in baseball. Once again, the National League owners weren't too fond of this guy for creating a players union, and they left him out of the Hall of Fame for many, many years. I think it was not until 1960 that they finally put him in the Hall of Fame.
And we spoke today, so important. I think you drove home the point that this period is so important. I think my listeners are going to get that out of this show. What do you think the American Association of Baseball lasting effect was? Because it folded, I think, in 1891, right after the Great.
Right. It merged with the National League, and so there's 4 teams from the original league that are still around. The L.A. Dodgers, which were the Brooklyn Dodgers, the St. Louis Cardinals, Pittsburgh Pirates, and the Cincinnati Reds. And they're all from that American Association. They're still some of the most treasured franchises in baseball. So that's one lasting impact. I think also the idea of baseball and beer being strongly associated. I think we have the American Association to thank for that. And Sunday baseball, they really popularized Sunday baseball. You can't imagine baseball not being played on Sundays, but that was the case in the early game. And, just the sense of fun and adventure and really taking risks and making things exciting. And that was all the influence of the American Association, I think. So I think it's a wonderful early league, and, there's so many great things associated with it. Just these funny early players. Some of them were big drinkers and carrying on, and so anyways, I think this is a very fertile period of baseball. They were creating the rules of baseball at this time. They were refining them almost every year, turning it into the game we love now. And I think baseball works because of the culture it grew out of, which was this intensely competitive culture, quick paced. You had to make decisions quickly, and putting a strong focus on individual skill. It wasn't just a team; it was were individuals rising above the rest of the group. And to me, that's the essence of America. That's the essence of baseball.
And you're absolutely right. You know what I tell people? I say, look, I'm so mad at Major League Baseball because of the exorbitant prices they charge. And I say, look, you want to know what true Americana is. You want to taste the local brew. Go to your minor league baseball team. When people go to McCoy Stadium, I use that as an example, they're going to get the Narragansett beer and lager. They're going to get the local flavors that you can't find, at the ballpark because they're monopolized by, say, the bigger companies and stuff. But I think if you go to the minor league teams, you're going to see a lot what we saw in the American Association, gimmicks to get people into the park and fireworks. I know McCoy has, and chowder and stuff like that, and it's a lot cheaper. I mean, you go to a ballpark, it's a whole salary, in Major League Baseball. You pay $9.
Yeah, I think baseball's killing itself the way it's doing things. I think it's pricing out families. It puts its premier games on too late at night, it's the greed. The instant greed is just killing it. I mean, it's killing it with future generations. The ad breaks are too long. The game is too slow. I mean, in the 1880s game was prized because it was like America. It was quick, fast-paced. It's hard to believe this was said about baseball, but was a fast-paced, exciting game. They had no commercial breaks between the innings, so it went quickly. They started games at 4 in the afternoon. They didn't have lights, so they had to play fast. These batters wouldn't step out of the batter's box and take their time. I mean, if any batter tried that in the 1880s, he would have been knocked on his ass. It was just this quick-paced game where you had to think on your feet, and different sport. I mean, the games were like an hour and a half or 2 hours long in the 1880s. Every game, I mean, one after another. And I think baseball's missing a lot by not encouraging it to be played somewhat along the lines as it was in its formative years. I mean, it was this kind of game where it wasn't too expensive. You could go there, you could have fun, you could drink a beer, and it was very quick paced.
Yeah, you know, your book is something that everybody should read, because it really does bring in the nature of the game, how it evolved, and how dangerous it was. But also, a lot of this stuff lasted well into the dead ball period. The one ball thing, spitting tobacco juice on it, you name it. Book. Where can we find this besides Amazon and Barnes and Noble?
Well, I think you can still find it in bookstores. It was published in 2013, but you can definitely get it on Amazon and sort of anybody that sells books. You can find it.
Great. And just hold the line. I've got to speak to the audience, let them know, shut down the show, and I'll be with you right after I do. Folks, this is one book to get. And if you don't believe me, go sample it on Amazon. I love the drawings in here from the newspapers back then, because, you know, I majored in history in college and got my master's, and it's just fantastic going through this book. It brings back a period of time that no longer exists. You know, it's the summer of beer and whiskey, how Brewers, Barkeeps, Rowdies, Immigrants, and a wild pennant fight made baseball America's game. Edward Achorn's the author of it. Thank you for being on the show. I'm Ian Kahanowitz. As always, this is how I end it, folks. You know, in the immortal words of Edward R. Murrow, good night, folks. Good luck. We'll see you next time.